Welcome students who are taking Math for Business and Finance and Math Applications. This here is for Chapter 11, Promissory Notes, Simple Discount Notes, and the Discount Process. This here is the theory portion of this chapter to kind of just go over the concepts. And reality is that this here chapter is, if you've gone through the last chapter, then this chapter is very, very simple, okay? So let's just move on. Okay, I included the calendar. You might want to keep that handy in order to be able to determine the number of days. All right. Interest-bearing versus non-interest-bearing notes. All right. Well, okay. Let's. Before I get started, let me just scribble down a lot of things here. All right. When we have a tendency to think about loans, okay, we have a tendency to think about mortgages, like on your house, or maybe an auto loan. And these are more longer term loans, meaning greater than a year, right? Now, if you generally, when you take out a loan for less than a year, they come in mostly called notes, and they're called promissory notes. And the reason why it's a promissory note is because most of the time it's just basically based upon your credit and your name, okay? There's nothing to back that loan. Like, for example, with a mortgage, you're putting up your house. That's not a promise. If you don't pay your mortgage, they take your house. And it's the same thing with the car. You're going along and, you stop making car payments, then somebody one day pulls up with a tow truck and tows your car away, okay? But with promissory notes, they're in shorter term, generally less than a year. And it's basically a signature loan. In other words, you're just going to sign your name, okay, and saying that you promise. And these come in the variety of usually like 30 or 60, 90, and even 120-day notes, okay. These are quite common in, for businesses, just for that short term that they need, okay. Now, they come in two types: interest-bearing and non-interest-bearing. Interest-bearing means that you promise to pay back a certain amount at a specific interest rate. Okay, so let me erase this. And so if I'm going to say I want to borrow, say $1,000, right, for 90 days, and at, I don't know, let's say 6% interest, okay, that's an interest-bearing note. And we've seen how we do that with simple interest in the previous chapter, okay? A non-interest bearing means that there is no interest attached. So in other words, if I had borrowed the $1,000 for 90 days and it's a non-interest bearing note, at the end of the 90 days, all that's owed is $1,000, okay? The face value. Now I'm getting into a new terminology here called face value. In the previous chapter, we had talked about principal. Okay, this is synonymous with what's called face value, okay, or FV for short, whereas principal is P. So you're going to be starting to see more the terminology face value, because that has more to do with our short-term notes and what the value of the note is, because we're going to talk about discounting in this particular chapter. In the previous chapter, it was just simple note, so that's why it was principal, okay? But when we have a note that has a principal amount and then we end up discounting it, okay, we have a face value amount. All right, so we're going to be thinking along the lines of face value, which basically still is principal, okay? It's just a little bit different. So different terminology for a different point in the process, okay? So interest bearing versus non-interest bearing. Interest bearing obviously has interest. Non-interest bearing means 0% interest, okay? All right, so in the last chapter, we had looked at a simple interest note, And now we're going to talk about a simple discount note. What's the difference between the two? And this chart is in your textbook, okay? And as you can see that for a simple interest note, we had talked about the face value and principal times rate times time. I is equal to, our formula, principal times rate times time. Well, instead of principal, we're talking about face value, okay? And that stays the same for our simple discount note, okay? We're going to calculate the amount of interest the same exact way. Now, the simple interest note is saying, okay, at our maturity date, when it's due, we had, and from the last chapter, you recall, principal plus interest is our maturity value. Well, again, we're replacing the principal with face value, so it's face value plus interest, right? So if you're looking at these numbers here, our interest was $186.67 on a $14,000 principal, okay? And so our maturity value is $14,186.67. You already know how to do this in the from the previous chapter, in chapter 10. But over here for our simple discounted note, notice that our maturity value is only the principal amount, the face value of $14,000. And the reason for that is because it has to be, we're discounting the note, okay? So it's not going to be the same maturity value, right? So for the simple interest note, proceeds is equal to the face value of $14,000, all right? But over here when we're discounting, okay, we're taking our maturity value of $14,000 and then we're subtracting out the bank discount or the interest, which gives us a new amount of proceeds. So in other words, when maybe the way to think about this is proceeds, okay, is when you go into the bank and you say, okay, I want to borrow $14,000, okay, and I want to borrow it, in this case here, at 8% for 60 days. Okay. If it's a simple interest note, right, what the bank is going to do is they're going to give you the full $14,000. Okay. And then at the end of the 60 days, you're going to have to write the check or bring the money back for $14,186.67. But if we're discounting the note, what happens is the bank wants their money up front. Okay, in other words, they want the interest immediately. It's a little bit more protection for them. So instead of them giving you the full 14,000, okay, they're going to take the interest right out, and they're only going to give you the proceeds. They're only giving you the money of $13,813.33. So they've taken their interest right away, right out of the note. Now, what does that do? Well, that changes the effective rate. Over here in the simple interest note, okay, where you're borrowing the $14,000 at 8%, right? Your interest rate is 8%, okay, and there's the calculation for the rate, right? But you were already told that the rate was 8%, right? If you work the math backwards because you know what the interest is, you know what the principal is, and you know the number of days, you can see that the effective rate is still the 8%, okay, on the 14,000. But over here, when the bank discounts it, they get a higher return, okay? They end up with an 8.11, 8.11% effective rate. By taking that money immediately, taking the interest right out of the proceeds, they get a greater rate of return on their money when you have to pay it back, okay? And you're paying back the full 14,000, okay? So this is why the banks will do, they discount notes, and the unsuspecting person thinks, oh, I'm borrowing 14,000, but they don't realize that they're paying a higher interest rate if it's discounted up front. Okay, so you have to be careful about that, but it's all a negotiating thing. The bank will say we want this, you say you want that. All right, and it all depends upon, you know, the transaction in and of itself. All right, there's no one set way. Just realize it's, um, you know, if you're not if you're not careful and you don't understand the analysis of these things, and you just let anything happen to you, it's sort of like, let's say, for example, you take a mortgage, okay? And let's say you're taking a mortgage for 100,000, and the bank might say, "Oh, okay, well, we'll give you the loan for 100,000, but maybe you want, I don't know, it's called a rehab fee or something like this, an adjustment. Well, we'll give you an extra 3% if you want in order to be able to do repairs in your house. So you're taking on a loan of 100,000." And you're saying, oh, well, 3% of 100,000 is another 3,000. Well, with that 3,000, I could buy a refrigerator, washer and dryer, stove, okay? And I don't need to have that money come out of my pocket immediately. Oh, so okay, I'll take that. Go ahead and give me that. So now your loan is 103,000, right? But if you didn't think through the ramifications, okay, that you're borrowing the 3,000. So, if you had 3,000 in your pocket, now all of a sudden, and you spent the 3,000 for the refrigerator, washer, dryer, and stove. Now instead of paying 3,000 because you had money in your pocket and you could have paid cash for it, instead now it's going to cost you more because you're going to pay interest on that additional three. And to the bank, the way they present it, it just seems like, oh, you're getting an extra 3,000 in order to be able to help you, move into your house, give you the 100,000 mortgage plus some extra cash. But if you're not thinking it through, you're not realizing that 100,000 plus the extra three, well, that 3,000 at, I don't know, let's just say 5% interest for 30 years. Well, let's quickly do the math here. 3,000 times 5% times 3, that's going, that washer dryer is now costing you, refrigerator, washer, dryer, and stove now cost you an extra $450, okay? And let's face it, that's the price of, almost the price of, that stove in and of itself. So just be aware that that happens, okay? And that's why the banks want to discount the note. Okay, so discounting on an interest-bearing note, okay, the way you do it is you calculate the interest, right? And we're familiar with this formula, principal times rate times time from the previous chapter, okay, from chapter 10, but now we're calling it face value, and the maturity value is the face value plus interest. Same thing, okay, just associate it in your mind. You don't have to memorize new formulas, okay? I don't have to memorize interest is equal to principal times rate times time. Then I have to memorize interest is equal to face value times rate times time. If I associate face value and equate it to principal, I only need to memorize one formula here, and the same over here. If I equate face value with the principal, I only need to really memorize one formula. I don't have to be memorizing 4 different formulas. Right? Just associate one in your mind with the other. Okay. Now, number 2, you calculate the number of days the bank will wait for the note to come due. That's the discount period. So, however many days that is, let's, like in the previous example, that was 60 days. Okay. That's the number of days that you're, on the note. Okay. Number 3, we're going to calculate the bank discount. All right. The maturity value times the bank discount rate times the number of days over 360, over the waiting period. So doesn't that look familiar? Maturity value, principal times discount, bank discount rate times time, days, right? Number of days over 360, right? That's a time component, right? So, associate what you need to do here with that formula. And then you're going to calculate the proceeds, which means, we had calculated our interest here. We take our maturity value, our 14,000 from the previous one, and subtracting out the $186.67, the bank discount amount, the charge, and then your proceeds end up being the 13,000 800 and whatever it was. All right, 813, 813.33. Okay, so this is not rocket science. You've done most of the hard work in the previous chapter of figuring out the simple loan, simple interest rate. The only real difference here is, since it's a discounting, right? Instead of receiving the full amount of the principal up front, right? What happens is the bank takes out an amount, the interest amount, as a discount, okay, and gives you the rest, right? So this principal now is not called principal, it's called face value. And that's really the only difference between the two, between last chapter and this chapter, this one little extra twist in having that discount. You're calculating the interest, but you're paying the interest up front. You know, think of it along the lines of the U.S. rule, you know, where you made a partial payment and you had to pay the interest up front. Well, this is the same exact thing, except you're not making a payment, you're just taking less of your principal that you're wanting to borrow. Okay, so with that said, this is going to be the only theory video, and we'll move on to the drill problems going forward. Okay, see you then.